Hello, my name is Al Babbit. I am the owner of the Messenger Art Collection. In our collection we have 21 film color separations of Marilyn Monroe from the red velvet photo shoot that was done in May 1949 by Tom Kelly, a famous photographer who used to take a lot of photos that ended up in various calendars and other print media of pinups. And I'm sure that many people have seen his work throughout decades since he started his career early on as an AP photographer. And this particular collection I've owned since 2010, and it includes 21 color separations that represent, that are unique in nature and were used to produce all of the calendars that were known as the Golden Dreams calendars throughout the 1950s and 1960s. These calendars were produced by the John Baumgarth Company out of Melrose Park, Illinois. And John Baumgarth at the time had a company that was the second largest calendar producer in the United States, produced around 25 million calendars a year. Although a small fraction of those calendars were nude calendars, the most famous calendar he ever produced was the Golden Dreams calendar involving Marilyn Monroe. And the circumstances, how they came into existence was pretty interesting as well. Just by happenstance, it was a confluence of events where Tom Kelly, back in October 1948, had a chance meeting with an unknown actress who became very famous, Marilyn Monroe, when she had an auto accident on Sunset Boulevard, and she was trying to get to an audition. And her car was damaged such that she couldn't make the audition, so Tom Kelly offered to give her $5 so she could get a cab, and also gave her his business card. She really didn't think too much about it for several months, and then around May 1949 she found herself with her car in repossession, behind on her rent, and she decided to stop by Tom Kelly's studios in Los Angeles, where he was fortunate in that, or she was fortunate in that a model had just called in sick for a photo shoot for a Pabst beer poster, and so Kelly offered to do the photo shoot for her and agreed to pay her a few dollars for it. So for a little while she was in a one-piece bathing suit with a beach ball and took the photo and made the poster, and Pabst loved it. As it happened to be, John Baumgarth a couple weeks later happened to be coming by and visiting the studio. Tom Kelly Studios was part of the pipeline of photographs that often were used in the Baumgarth calendars. So he stopped by the studio and happened to notice the Pabst beer poster on the wall. Asked about the model because she had the look that Baumgarth was looking for. There was a certain image that he was looking for a new calendar, and she seemed to fit the bill. So he asked Tom Kelly whether or not he thought that this model would pose in the nude and for a tasteful, artistic calendar. Kelly thought that she probably would not, but he reached out several times to her. Finally, his wife Natalie was successful in getting her to agree to do the photo shoot, and on May 27th, 1949, a Friday, for about 2 hours, Tom Kelly shot from a 10-foot ladder with the unknown model, of course Marilyn Monroe, writhing around, as it's described, on a red velvet drape, and that's how the name of the photo shoot became known as the Red Velvet photo shoot. There were 24 images taken at the time. Only 2 were ever commercialized. The one that is in the collection here and represented, Golden Dreams, was the most famous image. There was also one that was, the rights were acquired by Western Litho, called A New Wrinkle, which was also produced but didn't reach the notoriety of the Golden Dreams calendar. A little while later, there was an 8x10 transparency of the Golden Dreams photo shoot that had come up to Baumgarth, together with some other images, including one called The Charmer by Maxine Strong. And there was a selection committee that had been commissioned, including Baumgarth and 4 other folks, who were going to make the selection for the 1951 calendar year. And what happened is they looked at the various images, they looked at the 8x10 transparency of Marilyn and Maxine Strong and some others, and made their selections. Baumgarth and one of the other gentlemen on the committee actually selected Maxine Strong's The Charmer image, and the two ladies on the committee and one of the gentlemen selected Golden Dreams, a more tasteful, artistic representation. Baumgarth bowed to democracy and agreed to produce both calendars. And the interesting thing is that he was right in his selection, and that the Maxine Strong image outsold Marilyn's 2-1, because again, Marilyn was not known at the time. And then in March 1952, March 13th, 1952, there was an interview scheduled that Marilyn had with Elaine Mosby of UPI. And rumors had sort of been circulating at that time that the model seemed to resemble the budding star Marilyn Monroe. She hadn't really made that many movies, but had come out, but now she had been in The Asphalt Jungle, All About Eve, some of these Love Happy, and a few of these movies where she began to be recognized. And so she agreed to kind of use this opportunity to come out and admit that she was the model that actually posed nude for this calendar photo. And when it came out, there was pretty much universal forgiveness around the world, and it was an appreciation for the fact that she had said that she needed the money at the time, and she didn't felt that she had done anything wrong. And national forgiveness resulted, and it really began to launch her career and kind of changed the whole position that Hollywood had in issues like sexuality and what was permissible at the time. Hollywood was very puritanical at that time, and this was sort of a changing of the guard in terms of the mindset that a lot of folks had as to what was permissible. It was the first time a major star had ever posed in the nude, and with the acceptance that resulted, that sort of changed the whole dynamic in Hollywood. So what happened after that was that Marilyn went on to produce several successful movies, and the Golden Dreams calendars, around 9 million of them were sold that were produced legitimately by the Baumgarth Company. Millions others were produced in bootleg varieties as well and circulated. This particular collection represents the original separations that were used to produce all of the calendars throughout history. There was only one set that was produced, so these are unique items. The reason for that is because back in the 1950s, the whole color separation technology required significant manual color correction, hand correction, the use of masking techniques where a film positive and a negative would be used in conjunction to try to produce pure colors and higher resolution images. And so it was a very labor-intensive process. The separations in the collection are of the largest size that would have been produced for what they call the jumbo hangers, which is the largest and most popular format that the calendars would be produced in, 16 by 34. And however, these were used to produce all the calendars in various shapes and sizes that were produced over the years. The original images that were created were obviously the most popular ones for the calendars, and these particular calendars were distributed from automobile repair shops and radiator shops and places like that. So they weren't intended for hanging in museums or other artistic formats. So what happened was that back in the 1950s, of course, there were postal regulations that prohibited the mailing of nude images, and as a result, there were two other varieties of the calendars that were created by etching overlays over the original nude photo, nude imagery in the calendar. One was called Lure of Lace, which has a lace negligee superimposed over the nude image. Another was called Entrancing, which has another negligee, a little bit skimpier in nature, that was also used. And all three images, the original Golden Dreams nude, the Lure of Lace, and Entrancing, were all produced again throughout the 50s and 60s. What happened is that there was a young gentleman by the name of Hugh Hefner who had an interest in starting a men's interest magazine. Many of the publications at the time that were geared towards men were more outdoors in nature, hunting and fishing type magazines. He wanted to create one that had contemporary stories about things of interest in men, fashion, current events, and a variety of things. So he was trying to figure out a way to get a splash to make his first publication. And he borrowed about $8,000 in order to produce the magazine. And what he had thought about was the Golden Dreams photo that he had seen, and he approached John Baumgarth and offered to license the photo from him, and they negotiated a price for $500. And Baumgarth agreed to give him the rights to produce the Golden Dreams image in all formats except the calendar format, and Baumgarth continued to produce those. Of course, he had already created these films, so he didn't really need the original color transparency any longer, and so he agreed to provide that to Hugh Hefner. He went on to publish 54,000 copies of that initial magazine. Hugh Hefner isn't named in it, and he wasn't sure that there would ever be a second run, so he never dated the original Playboy magazine. However, because Marilyn was featured as the first sweetheart of the month, it sold approximately 54,000 copies, which provided the funding for him to continue on and publish and eventually, develop the entire Playboy empire. The calendars were produced through a very complicated process at the time. This is well before Photoshop or any sort of digital techniques were available. So what would have happened is an original 8x10 photo transparency, which looks very much like a standard photograph. In some cases it is just a photograph. In other cases it's an image that's imparted on a particular type of transparent media that allows you to photograph through the use of filters and separate out the four primary colors that are used for the multicolor print jobs at the time. That would be cyan, which is processed blue, magenta, which is processed red, yellow, and black. Black gives depth to the other colors. And so what would have happened here to produce these images is that the original 8x10 transparency would have been photographed and exposed in enlarged film in this case, because they were creating these separations in the large jumbo format at 16x34, and so they would have imaged the original transparency in an enlarged film substrate, and basically what they would do is create initially a negative. So the way they would do that is to produce the cyan processed blue color, they would have used a red filter. For the magenta, they would have used a green filter. For the yellow, a blue filter, and then they would have used a yellow filter to produce the black images. And that way they subtract out the other colors, and it just creates an image of those primary colors. Then what they would do is expose the continuous negative, and that original product that would be produced would be a negative, and they would screen that. So they would actually burn another piece of film through a screen that would impart a dot matrix image on it called halftone dots. And what that does is that allows the ink on the plate to adhere to the plate, to the image area, so that because in a continuous tone image it wouldn't actually allow the ink to adhere to the image. So they would create a continuous tone negative, which would then be shot through a screen to expose a positive image that would be a halftone film positive. In many cases, the color corrections, which you can see when you look at some of the films that are in the collection, would be made on that film positive. They would also then create a screened negative from that, and then a final positive image typically, and then that way they've increased the dot resolution in the pattern on the film, so that they would get a sharper and purer color imparted when they actually created the plates. And then what would happen is that final film positive would again be exposed through a very bright light, and it would burn an image on a thin aluminum lithographic plate that had a chemical treatment on that would identify the areas where the ink is going to adhere to, and the areas where it would not, where the fountain solution, as they go through the printing process, would make sure that the ink would not adhere. And that way you get a very crisp image of each of the primary colors. And then what would happen is they would print each of the primary colors in sequence, and it would produce all the colors of the rainbow essentially through overlays of those primary colors. And that's how they would reproduce the image.